Good evening, hello and welcome to Late Night Catechism. And tonight we continue, we've almost completed now, but we continue with our thoughts on the theological virtues. The theological virtues, remember, they are the four cardinal virtues and the three theological virtues, namely faith, hope and charity. And tonight we're going to discuss the last one, charity. Now, part of the problem with discussion about charity is the paucity of the English language vocabulary in terms of love. See, we only have the one word for love in English. And the trouble with that is that love, as we generally use it, doesn't adequately describe the virtue of charity. Now, charity itself derives, of course, from caritas and from the Greek agape. And it means a selfless love. It means a self-giving love. It means a sacrificial love. And charity is a virtue, and as our understanding of it is incredibly important, it's foundational, fundamental to everything else that we believe as Christians. Deus says caritas, or caritas says Deus, says St. John in his Gospel. God is love. God is charity, is caritas, is sacrificial love, is self-giving, selfless love. And essentially, one of the reasons why perhaps we find it so difficult to practice charity is because of our sense, essentially because of our sense of self, because of our selfishness, because of our ego, because of me, myself, and I. What I mean by that is that we relate everything to ourselves, don't we? Now, in one respect, that's going to be kind of obvious because we can only, of course, subjectively appreciate everything from our own particular individual perspective. Except that that's not quite true, is it? Because we can actually rationalize, we can think outside of the box. We can actually think and even believe about and of things that we have had no experience of, have no subjective appreciation of. And we do that, of course, by varying degrees of trust, might even say faith, in processing, evaluating, and understanding information and knowledge. So that we trust when somebody says to us, don't touch that, that's very hot. Most of us will say, okay, weighing up the probabilities, evaluating the information that we're being given, and having a sense from knowledge and perhaps from previous empirical data, we know what hot is. So we accede to their request. Children, of course, who are still learning, often they don't. Often they will touch something that's hot even though they've been told not to, even though the person who's telling them not to knows better. Children invariably have to, it seems, try things, test things for themselves. It's part of growing up. It's part of the way in which we learn. And I suppose that's the nub, isn't it? that's the thing, is that we tend still invariably to grow and develop by testing things for ourselves, by trying things out for ourselves. And so again, you see, it's all relational to ourselves. So we relate everything to ourselves. And the trouble is that charity, of course, demands the opposite. Charity, by its very nature, being selfless, one might even say self-disinterested, is then, of course, the antithesis to the way in which we perceive things and relate to things. The intriguing thing about charity is the fact that it is something we can't, as it were, learn. In the sense that it is so antithetical, as it were, to the usual, to the normal way in which we think and relate and understand things. And that is perhaps why we find it so difficult. And yet, at the same time, it's something we consider and can recognize to consider to be extremely desirable. Now, charity, it is said, is something that is infused by God through grace. Indeed, the charity is not something we can, as it were, automatically realize or generate from ourselves, at least not from our usual, not from our natural selves, shall we say, not from our biological selves, and not from the sort of base level of our human existence. It's not something that comes naturally. Not something that comes naturally. Now, if you think about this in terms of the way that otherwise we think of love, in all the other types of love in relationships, if you analyze them, you see that they are, in fact, reciprocal. Generally, they are reciprocal. So, for example, the love between two lovers, it's reciprocal. They both get something out of it. The love between siblings, again, is generally reciprocal. The love between parents and children, again, is sort of reciprocal. Love between friends is reciprocal. But charity is a kind of love that loves for love's sake and isn't interested in what it gets back. Now, one of the things that sometimes people find difficult in appreciating then and understanding the nature of charity with, for example, God, see, it's very easy for people to think of loving God as some kind of reciprocal, another kind of reciprocal arrangement of a reciprocal relationship. If I love God and God loves me, then God will be good to me, kind of thing. And certainly, generalizing, of course, but from scriptures, and particularly from the Old Testament, it seems that God is always asking for humanity's love. But the thing to remember is, of course, that although God asks us to love, and though, of course, God does indeed want us to love, he doesn't need our love. He may desire our love. He certainly commands us to love. But God isn't interested in our love for his own sake. And this really speaks to the real nature of charity. See, God just desires that we love in the way that he loves, which is just to be continually loving. When we've reflected on the other virtues, particularly on the cardinal virtues, we kept referring to the common good. We kept referring to the good, and that God is good. And that the end of the cardinal virtues is all about good. Either the ultimate good for ourselves, which is union with God, or the ultimate good of the other. Now, in terms of charity, the good that God desires is that we realize love and generate love in the way that he does. Now, some of you who are familiar with my teaching will have heard me say this before, that it is, of course, charity that binds the Trinity in unity. With charity being selfless, and charity being self-generating, and charity being continually turned outward, that the reason for our existence was so that we could receive God's love, so that we could receive that charity from the Trinity. Indeed, we were conceived, we were born out of that love. And God didn't create us just so that we could love by return, but we were created from his love as an expression and a manifestation of his love, so that his love could love. And when God says that he wants us to love, he means to love in the same way. See, we might say of charity that it is the love that keeps giving. It is the love that keeps loving. And it is love for its own sake. Or, actually, rather than love for its own sake, it's not even for its own sake. Charity loves to beget love. So the Trinity in unity, bound by charity, desires to share that love, that charity with others. And so we are created. And we are created from that love, to experience that love, and in our turn to become that love. And it works, therefore, as it comes full circle. Just as the charity between the three persons of the Trinity binds them in unity, so then the charity that creates us and desires us to create charity will eventually, of course, itself come back to manifesting charity towards God. Because it is the nature of charity to beget itself and to share itself and to perpetuate itself. It is the nature of charity to increase and to grow. Now, we talk about three fruits of charity as being joy, peace, and mercy. And I would say that they are the key to understanding and exercising and manifesting charity ourselves. Now, we know, of course, that charity, by its nature, must go out from itself. And as I've said recently, when we manifest real charity, sincere, genuine charity, for example, when we do something for somebody else with no self-interest at all, and we see the reaction and the response of the person for whom we've done that selfless thing for, and that sense of warmth, that sense of satisfaction, that sense of fulfillment that we receive, as I said before, is that's as it were how we know that we have manifested charity. But when you think about the fruits of charity, read joy and peace and mercy, we see in the way that we ourselves react and respond to charity how those three fruits may be generated, and how by understanding those three fruits we might ourselves be better at living charity. So that in any, as it were, given situation, we might use, because remember, the mother of virtue is prudence. So using our noddle, using our ability to reason, we can learn how to apply and thus manifest charity towards these ends, towards joy and peace and mercy. So in any given situation, we can look at a situation, we can ask ourselves, what will bring joy? What will bring peace? What will bring mercy? And if we remember these three things and try to apply them, we will manifest charity. We will manifest charity. So if you think of an interaction with anyone about anything, and recall joy, peace, and mercy, you can then rationalize, reason, use prudence and right judgment, wisdom, to see how one of those three ends may be achieved. So in this situation, how can I affect joy? In another situation, how can I bring peace? In another situation, how can I bring mercy? But as I say, it's not easy for us, because so often we think of everything in reciprocal terms. And that's just it. Charity is completely not interested in the self at all, except, we might say, in the wider sense, for the goodness of ourselves. But charity, of course, wills good for the other, wills real good and true good for the other. And again, those three fruits of peace, joy, and mercy can all bring good to somebody else. And we see, of course, then, how God himself is charity and charitable towards us. Because what does God desire for us? But joy and peace and mercy. What does he show toward us? Joy, peace, and mercy. What does he desire for our souls? Joy, peace, and mercy. To rest in him, to know his love, to remain in his love, to be completed, fulfilled by his love. And the commandment to love God is not so much God demanding our love, but it's simply that if we become charity, then we will love him by default. Because again, that love will want to be expressive and exteriorized. And that's how it all comes, as it were, full circle. So charity binds the Trinity in unity. That same charity generates us to receive that charity, and in our turn to generate that charity. And in generating that charity, we will return charity to the source of charity. And so it all comes full circle. But the practice of charity, manifesting charity, that's where, of course, we come unstuck so often. And as I say, it's because our base level, as it were, is orientated towards self rather than selflessness. And this is why when we discuss the virtues, we're always appealing to our higher intellect. We're always appealing to our use of reason, or our ability to rationalize, to, as it were, elevate and separate our base instincts and passions and lusts by engaging in our minds and taking control. But left to our own devices, as I said, left to our own devices, we would not naturally manifest charity. And that's why we say it is an infused grace that we receive at baptism. It is itself something that we receive from God. But it's not something that, left to ourselves, we would automatically generate. We wouldn't. Because of sin, because of the fall, because of the disease and the corruption that is sin and that is evil, because of our default self-interest. And this, you see, is the thing with regard to discussions about morality and objective morality, etc. Could we as human beings be moral? Could we behave morally with each other if there wasn't a God? And ultimately, of course, we would have to say as Christians, well, no. Because left to our own devices, we would never conceive of charity. If we were just operating at our base instincts, we would A, only be interested in ourselves, and B, only be interested in reciprocal relationships that benefited ourselves. So we might indeed, left as it were to our own devices, we might indeed develop love in terms of eros, love in terms of philos, all those other types of love that are basically about reciprocal relationships. But selfless love, sacrificial love, we would never come up with ourselves. Why would we? There is no, as it were, obvious benefit to selflessly loving others. And so that's why we say that love, charity, is infused by grace. It's only because of God that we can A, recognize, and B, manifest charity, selfless love. Left to ourselves, we'd never come up with it. And that is, really the argument against, for example, with atheists about objective morality, etc. That if we look at the history of humanity, it's quite obvious that we would never evolve into a species that would develop or value a quality like charity, like selflessness. Now, sometimes, of course, people would say, "Oh, well, but wouldn't parental animals, for example, they will sacrifice themselves for the sake of their offspring." Yes, but the reason they do that is because their future is in the offspring. They're not doing it selflessly, as it were. It's that whole survival of the species thing. And then people will say, "Oh, well, but we all like niceness. We all like to be nice, and we all like to receive niceness." And you're back again to the reciprocal point. Yeah, it's we all like, it's all nice to be nice, because really you receive nice back. Without God, we would not. conceive nor develop nor evolve into a charitable species. It just wouldn't happen. And part of the, part of the proof in that is look at humanity. For however many thousands of years we've existed, we haven't really evolved very much, have we? We're still fundamentally selfish. We still are fundamentally base in our preferences and in our instincts. We would sooner lash out, so we would sooner vent anger, we would sooner go to war. We would sooner distrust rather than trust. If you think of the 2,000 years since the incarnation, since God was one of us, and since God walked on this earth and lived and breathed and talked directly to us, for all that, and for all the presence of those who generation after generation have received those teachings and tried themselves to manifest and live those teachings, even so, we cannot say that everyone in the world today can always experience joy, peace, and mercy, nor that everyone in the world today will practice joy, peace, and mercy. These that are the fruits of charity. So that is why the Church teaches that charity is an infused grace, and that for us as Christians, we receive it in baptism, but otherwise we might say we receive it by God's grace, however that is transmitted to us, whether that's in the assured way through the sacraments or in another way. But to become charitable, one has to, as it were, have received it from God. And it's possible, of course, to say that one could reason one's way to charity. Certainly that is, we might have to say that that is a possibility. It is possible that people could reason themselves to charity, but again, really only by being exposed to charity and being persuaded that charity was worth realizing. And again, if left to our selfish ends, one indeed might conceive it, one indeed might think about it, but again, what would be the compunction? What would compel one to practice it? So in terms then of manifesting ourselves charity, of living charity, this is why, again, why Christ says, if anyone would be a disciple of mine, he must deny himself first. Because the only way to really manifest charity is to get over oneself, to get over that inherent selfishness that is us, our ego, our me, myself, and I, get over that, so that in order that we can manifest selfless interest, care, compassion for the other, that we can desire joy, peace, and mercy, and show and demonstrate joy, peace, and mercy for the other. And as I say, this can really only be developed by engaging the mind and using the higher intellect and our ability to reason. Now, that's not to say, of course, that some can and do manifest charity seemingly easily, though they may not have full command nor capacity to fully rationalize and reason. But here again, we would have to say, well, that's surely evidence of God's grace working or at work in them. Here I'm thinking, perhaps of certain types of mental disability, for example. It seems a wonder to me that such people are gifted, it seems to me, seem to be gifted by God with a real gift of charity. Because, as it were, it makes up for their inability to otherwise think and reason as most of us would, because they haven't got that capability or they haven't got that capacity. Somehow God seems to infuse them with a greater level of charity, and they seem able to manifest it and indeed generate it in others with relative ease. I'm thinking, for example, particularly of people with Down syndrome, who are, of course, very topical at the moment with the various screening protocols, re-pregnancies. But it's rare. I can't think of, and I've met and known a lot of Down syndrome people, and met a lot of people who have worked with and who know Down syndrome people, who are parents or siblings of Down syndrome people. I can't think of a single Down syndrome person who has not seem to have an innate sense, an innate gift for manifesting charity and bringing charity out in others. In other words, I can't think of a really difficult or really mean or really selfish Down syndrome person. I've never met one. And I can't think of anyone else I know who knows and knows well Down syndrome people either, who could think of or come up with an example of one who was mean or selfish. That's not to say, of course, that they don't have any self-interest. That's not to say, of course, that they don't that they can't be angry or they can't be difficult or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about, though. They can be all of those things. Of course they can, but it just seems to me that God has particularly infused them with a greater, ability to manifest and generate charity. And certainly to bring about the fruits of charity, namely joy and of peace and of mercy. And some of them, of course, are able are able to rationalize and reason charity and manifest the fruits of charity deliberately. But it's always interesting, it seems, that contrast to me, I think, is always intriguing to me, it's always interesting to me, that they are able, in a very special and a particular and a unique way, to manifest and generate charity in a way that the rest of us find not easy and find difficult. And I can't really put my finger on that. Because again, it's not usually because of ignorance. It's not because of naivety either, often. There seems an element of seeing the better, seeing the best, seeing the good in others. And I think that's, something that the rest of us can learn from, and can learn ourselves. There does seem to be something about the nature of sin, a little bit like dust in Philip Pullman's Dark Materials trilogy. It does seem that once one's affected by dust, by sin, that somehow one then becomes more cynical, I suppose, of the world, more easily judgmental, less open to the possibility of goodness. That's rather sad, isn't it? But that's, we have to say that's the result of sin. And sin does damage us in more ways than we usually think of, not just in terms of particular acts, but actually it damages us in perception, damages us in insidiously in the way we think, in the way we react and respond to things, the way we think about things. But that's why, you see, the rest of us perhaps need to try to remember things like the fruits of charity being joy, peace, and mercy, in order to guide ourselves and allow ourselves and enable ourselves to manifest and generate charity, and engaging our higher mind and our ability to reason and to rationalize. Now again, I've avoided so far, this is good for me, that's 45 minutes. And I mentioned sacrificial love maybe half dozen times at the beginning of the hour. So, and I say this because, again, as many of you who will know, who are familiar with my teaching, sacrificial love is, I'm always talking about sacrificial love, because that is the definition of charity. But another way of appreciating and thinking about charity is perhaps to focus on the generational aspect. By the generational aspect, I mean the generating aspect. generating aspect of charity. Perhaps for some of us, it helps better to focus on the fruits and intend to realize those fruits, that they may be, the consequences of our actions, the consequences of our deeds and of our interactions with others. I mean, certainly, to live a virtuous life is to desire the good of the other, the ultimate good of the other, not just good in a general sense, but the ultimate good, which is to know God. And so the exercise, so the things necessary for us to bring around or to realize the fruits of joy, peace, and mercy they help us, as it were, to focus on a goal. So what I'm trying to say is that in our interactions with others, we might think to ourselves, how can I bring about the realization of joy, peace, and mercy? How can I express joy, peace, and mercy? How can I induce joy, peace, and mercy for and in the other? As I say many times, a ready reckoner, of course, for generally living the present moment in our lives is to think self or sacrifice. But as it were, further, I might add to that in terms then of sacrifice in service of another, then we might ask ourselves, what can be generated here? Joy, peace, or mercy, or any combination of two or all three. How can I, in this situation, respond sacrificially in such a way as to produce that fruit? Or ask myself, in order to effect that fruit, what must I do sacrificially? You see, my brothers and sisters, how we cannot just live our lives in subjective emotional responses. You see, it would be nice. I know many of us would think, it would be nice. Charity just means that it would be nice if I just always loved others. Okay? But the trouble is with that is that we have such connotations of love. The trouble is that we have such a whole subjective appreciation of love and loving. If we leave our concept of charity in that as a kind of sentiment or emotion, invariably we are not going to practice it. We're not going to realize it, not in its true sense. And if only because generally our emotions desire to generate emotions in others, whereas charity is not about that. Again, you see, it's that kind of reciprocal thing. In order to be able to practice selfless love, we have to engage our higher mind in order to get over our subjective emotional reactions and responses. In other words, put it in simple terms, the only way to get over anger, for example, is to engage the mind. Likewise, the only way to get over despair is to engage the mind. And likewise, then, the only way for us to inculcate and to generate and to manifest and induce others charity is to use our intellect. Is to use this ability to think, as it were, to think and to reason almost dispassionately. And I think this for many people is the key. To stop thinking about charity emotionally and to appreciate charity objectively and consider it objectively, think about it objectively, and thus reason it objectively, and make of it then an objective end, a goal that can be objectively again realized. See, because so often what prevents us from realizing charity is our subjective and emotional reaction and response to things. So that if we don't like the look of someone, that will prevent us. If we've fallen out with someone, that will prevent us. If we are in a mood, if we are tired, if we are despairing, if we are, almost any emotional situational condition that we might ever at any stage or time find ourselves in, will and can of itself generally prevent us from manifesting charity. The only time I can think that the only situation I can think of when one might manifest charity through emotion might be euphoria. You know how when people are not in full possession of their mind, under the influence, say, of a narcotic or alcohol, or just because or because of something else, a joy that they're experiencing. If somebody's won the pools, or I suppose won the lottery would be a better thing, then in that kind of euphoric sort of scenario, it might be said to be easier then, and people often are, can be selfless in that moment. The guy who's won the football pools and buys the whole pub a drink, kind of thing. But even then, of course, it's not really properly charity, because there is no exercise of prudence. It's not necessarily a virtuous act. It might indeed be said to be the opposite. And then perhaps, there isn't either the element of a deliberate intention to will the good of the other. In fact, all you're doing is just sharing or desiring that others share in your euphoria, in your joy. You're not necessarily willing to give them joy too. For that to be true, you would buy them more than a drink. You would share your winnings with them and not count the cost. So I think that's an important thing to remember about charity, is that it should not be something really that is dependent upon or motivated by our emotions. We should have compassion for the poor and the needy, irrespective of our emotions. When we see somebody in need in the street, we shouldn't be relying on how we feel at that particular moment as to whether or not we generate and manifest charity. So as I say, this is why, in order for us to be manifesting and generating charity in any present moment, it requires full engagement of our sensibilities and of our mind, of our abilities to rationalize and reason. If it were just left as an emotional response, invariably it would never happen. As I say, I think that's an important thing to appreciate, because again, so many confuse the notion of charity and love with the way in which we generally think and experience love, which is actually that reciprocal thing, not that selfless thing. And this is why we say that of charity it is a virtue. Because what is common to all the virtues, what is common to all the heavenly virtues, is that it requires the whole person to manifest them. It requires the engagement of the mind, engagement of the will, to some extent an engagement of the body in terms of being able to do whatever is required practically to realize a virtue. And remember that the Christian life is all about realizing wholeness and completeness and balance. And again, that's why it helps to divorce, as it were, charity from a wholly reactionary response, subjective appreciation, emotional response, etc. It is interesting. It is. I find fascinating how we confuse our understanding and appreciation of charity with our understanding and appreciation of reciprocal love. See, again, with charity, for example, charity is not interested in how I feel. My motivation to be charitable should not be concerned with how I feel. Again, I think, sometimes, because what I'm trying to say is that because I should be selfless and I should be charitable irrespective of myself. The exercise of charity is not dependent upon my state and condition of being, except in as much as I desire to will the good, the supreme good of the other. And that I should desire that will, that it should be my desire, and therefore cause my will to be moved to act and to generate and manifest charity. Now, I know some will find that very difficult to maybe to conceive of, to understand, let alone appreciate, because so bound up is our notion of love and indeed compassion with emotion. And yet charity is not about emotion. Though charity is love, it is not emotional, it's not sentimental. It's not irrational. And in all these ways, you see, it is not like romantic love. It is not like sibling love. It is not love like friendship love. It is, as it were, we might say, a higher form, a higher kind of love. Exactly because it is not dependent on feelings. And it shouldn't be dependent on feelings. And that's why I say, like all the virtues, it requires us to get over ourselves, to be able to manifest it. Well, that, my brothers and sisters, is our hour. I hope that was interesting for you. I hope it was ultimately, of course, helpful for you. Next week, we'll do, as it were, a recap of the heavenly virtues. So the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues. We'll do a sort of whole recap of them together. Before then, thinking again more about how we manifest them, how we inculcate them, how we form a way of living that will enable us to live them. And that should bring us then nicely up to Advent. Speaking of Advent, we're thinking of perhaps ceasing Catechism for Advent, and instead having scriptural study, and particularly looking at the readings, the lections of the Advent Sundays. So the idea would be that we would have the Sunday on Sunday. We'll hear the readings, and you can have then from Sunday through to Wednesday to read the readings yourself, think about them, and then we will have a study. And hopefully, if I can, if we can make it work, we'll try and make that interactive by using Zoom. So you'll need to, if you haven't already, you will need to use a Zoom account, or indeed we might use Teams, not sure yet, but that would mean that we'd be able to have a real-time discussion and scriptural study. So that's what we're sort of working to and thinking about and are developing for Wednesdays in Advent. Well, there we are. Well, my brothers and sisters, thank you for joining me. Tomorrow, of course, there's Mass, the Angelus is, and reflective Rosary, and the next show, as it were, proper, will be Friday night with Contra Mundum. So until then, as always, God bless you. Thank you for watching, and remember, God loves you. Good night. Take care.